Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Boosting Climate Confidence Throughout the Newsroom. I'm Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the Executive Director of Covering Climate Now, which is a global consortium of hundreds of news outlets that reach a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people. I'm also the Environment Correspondent for The Nation magazine. We are co-hosting this event, and we are proud to say so, along with Climate Matters in the Newsroom and also WFAA, the ABC affiliate in Dallas. Special thanks there to Carolyn Mungo and Leslie McCardle at WFAA. We're here today because climate change is the defining issue of our time. As global temperatures keep rising, causing more destructive weather, and now with a climate realist in the White House who's pledging bold climate action, covering the climate story is no longer optional for newsrooms. It's an imperative. This webinar will get you ready, even if you're relatively new to the story. We have a stellar group of panelists from across the region, and they'll be sharing some climate science and also their own stories of how they got up to speed on the climate story, challenges that they faced along the way, and especially ideas for how you can tell human-centered, localized stories that engage audiences. We'll flag some common mistakes that you want to avoid and also some best practices to emulate. And of course, plenty of time for Q&A. A couple of housekeeping notes. You're invited to tweet and converse with one another throughout the webinar. Check down in your chat box at the bottom of the screen. You can reach out to panelists directly. You can talk to the other participants as you wish. You'll also find the Twitter handles for today's event in that chat box. We've already received a lot of questions in the RSVPs, but please keep them coming there in the chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We will pause twice during this 90-minute webinar to be sure that all your questions are being addressed. The first time will be after our opening presentations focused on the climate science. And then again, we'll pause after we hear from the various journalists on our panel, 3 of them today. And then finally, in conclusion, we'll share some resources that you can take with you and access as you go about covering the defining story of our time. Now, let me quickly introduce all of our panelists all at once here, and then we'll get right into the program. First, it is my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Hayo. She is the scientist at the Climate Center at Texas Tech University, and also now newly the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. And at the risk of embarrassing her, I will say that Catherine is truly a giant in the field. She has contributed to 125 peer-reviewed studies and reports, including the U.S. National Climate Assessments and various U.S. National Academy of Science reports. So welcome to Catherine. Also, David Schechter. He's the reporter, host, and co-producer of Verify Road Trip from WFAA TV and Tegna Media. David recently won a DuPont Columbia Award for his Verify Road Trip report, where he takes one of his viewers, a climate skeptic, along with him to Alaska to see climate change for himself. Stopping first for a briefing with Dr. Hayo. And we've been a big champion of that. And David also wrote an excellent piece for us at Covering Climate Now and the Columbia Journalism Review, our co-founder, that talked about his own journey towards gaining climate confidence. I highly recommend that. It's a short piece. You can read it in 3 minutes. And I think it will really help all of us on this call to understand why it's important not to be intimidated, especially by the science aspects of this. Moving on from David, Lisa Olsen is the investigations editor at the Texas Observer. Lisa has more than 20 years of experience in breaking big investigative stories, much of it at the Houston Chronicle. In addition to her environmental work and climate that she'll be talking about today, she has covered crime, corruption, worker safety, and human rights. And 3 times she has been named the Texas AP Managing Editor's Star Reporter of the Year. So thank you, Lisa, for joining us here. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Diana Hunt. She's of Cherokee Nation descent, and she is a senior editor at Indian Country Today, which I'm proud to say is one of our new partners here at Covering Climate Now. Previously, Diana was a reporter and editor at the Houston Chronicle, and in a sign of true dedication to journalism, she's also been a newspaper publisher. Welcome, Diana. And then finally, my esteemed colleague at at Climate Matters in the Newsroom, long a Covering Climate Now partner and collaborator, Bernadette Woods-Plackey. Bernadette has been a TV meteorologist, beginning actually back in Baltimore, where my own dad was in the TV anchorman business, and now is the basically the inspiration and the director of Climate Central and Climate Matters in the Newsroom. They have done stellar work in recent years, reaching out to meteorologists across the country, getting them to understand that the climate story is not a matter of politics, it's really a matter of science. And that as journalists, we have got to have our work grounded in science. One final note as we kick off here, Covering Climate Now next week is beginning our next stage of climate coverage. Twice a year, we do special weeks of climate coverage around a given theme. Our next week begins next Monday, April 12, and it continues through Earth Day on April 22. All newsrooms are invited to join us, and the theme of that coverage is Living Through the Climate Emergency. And now it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Bernadette and Catherine.
Thanks, Mark. So thanks for having us today, everybody. We're really excited that you're joining us, and we're so excited for this discussion. Mark set it up so nicely. It's the story of our time, and we're going to cut through all of this so you can understand more deeply the science and ways to communicate this science. And the first thing we want to do before we get into all of that is set the stage. The golden rule of communication: know your audience, right? And there's a lot of misconception about who our audience is with, their understanding of climate change. So I'm going to start here, and just bear with me as I share my screen and get this into mode here to play. What you're looking at is a chart from Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and George Mason's Center on Climate Change Communication. What they do is, going back to 2008, twice a year, they have surveyed the public on views and understanding of the subject matter. And they have found that the public in general in the United States fits into 6 different categories. You see them represented in these bubbles. On the left, the alarm, the concern. This is well over half of the population. Now let's shift all the way to the right. This is the group, the dismissive, that's 7% of the population. They're the ones that have the really loud voice on Twitter and are going to call things out a lot, but it's less than 10% of the population. Those center bubbles, they're the ones that are very distracted with life, but are open to hearing the conversation. They're news consumers, maybe not the people that are tweeting at you and answering you with everything. But if you look at this breakdown, if you avoid the topic of climate change, you're catering your communication to less than 10% of the population. You're missing the bulk of society that wants to hear more, and over half of the 50% there that is really concerned and wants to do something about this. So there's another way to look at this, right? Where we are in the country, because you might say, hey, those numbers are coming from somewhere else. It's not necessarily the case. What they've done is downscale this data into counties across the country. It's really fascinating information. Google Yale Climate Opinion Maps. We'll also share it in the chat with you if you want to get into it now, even while we're talking about it. But you can see that across the country, people are overwhelmingly convinced that the climate is changing. We start to see those numbers drop off when it comes to human causation, personal harm, and you zoom in on Texas, even Texas, and I've heard some people challenge this fact to me, so I wanted to show it to you. Most of the population in Texas is concerned about climate change and wants to know more. So this is your audience. Another thing too, here are all the ways they've broken down those questions. So in the different counties, you can look at each one of these questions, the different ways that they're viewing climate change. And where we see the numbers go really high is that question a little farther down about renewable energy sources. This is a winner across the board. This is why we're here today, though. One of the questions talks about hearing about climate change in the media. It's not happening as much as it should be, being that this is the story of our time. And there is even more research on this showing that people want to hear about it. So when specifically asked the question, do you want to hear about climate stories? 74% wants to. There's a whole host of questions and the types of stories too that you can explore. And when you zoomed in on Texas, look at that. Everyone's in the yellows, the oranges, and the reds. They want to learn more about how climate change is affecting them. So that really sets the stage for jumping into this conversation. And with that, I have the pleasure of, well, first stopping to share my screen here. Those are slides for later. I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, who I'm lucky enough to call a friend. She's fantastic. You're going to absolutely enjoy her presentation here today. So take it away, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I'm a climate scientist at Texas Tech University. And as you know, in Texas, West Texas is one of the more conservative corners of the state. If you can talk about climate change here, you can talk about it anywhere. Here's what you need to know. First of all, I want to start with weather versus climate. We're going to go full circle right back around here. Weather is what our brains remember. And so whenever we have a heat wave, people say, oh, that must be global warming. Whenever we have a cold wave, people say it's freezing. Where's global warming now? But the reality is that although our brains are built to remember weather, weather is simply what happens in a certain place at a certain time. It can be cold or hot, it can be wet or dry. Climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. It's like the forest. And our brains are not built to remember climate. That's part of the problem that we have. The way I look at it is this: weather is the ups and downs, right? What's climate? Climate is the long-term average as well as the statistics of how extreme heat or drought or storms or heavy rainfall are changing over climate timescales, which is at least 20 to 30 years. Why does climate matter? I mean, if weather is all we really remember, why does climate matter? Well, it turns out climate matters because our entire civilization and society is built on an assumption that we rarely take out and look at, the assumption that our climate is actually stable, that the highs and the lows we've seen in the past, the 500-year flood event, the drought of record, as well as the long-term average, these are what predict our future conditions. What aspects of human society are built on these assumptions? Pretty much everything. Our building codes for our buildings and our infrastructure, what type of crops we grow, where and when and how much energy we plan for, how much water we plan for, whether we have a snowplow or not, whether we have, where we draw our flood zones, all of this is based on the past. And this approach works when our roads are so straight that we can stay on the road by looking in the rearview mirror. So if you're driving down a dead straight road in West Texas or New Mexico or Arizona, if you're driving down a dead straight road there, looking in the rearview mirror, you're actually going to be able to stay on the road. Why? Because the road is so straight, it's not changing. But what happens if that road is changing? If that road has any curves in it and we're only looking backwards, we're going to run off the road. So that's why climate matters. Climate is the road, and we are driving down that road looking in the rearview mirror. But today, our wheels are already on the rumble strip. We can already hear the warning. We can see that our systems, our infrastructure, our water, our health, and more, we can see that our systems are being pushed beyond what they were ever designed to see. We see that our long-term average is changing. So we can still have cold weather, of course. We can still have hot weather. We can still have dry. We can still have wet. But decade by decade by decade, our average temperature is steadily ticking upwards. Why do we care about it? We care about it not because the average temperature of the planet matters to you or me or any of us on this call. We care about it because changes in our average temperature affect everything else that we care about. Literally everything. And to push back against something that we often hear, we're not talking about saving the planet here. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. We are talking about saving us. That's why climate matters to everyone. How do we know that climate is changing, though? People might say, how do we really know that this is happening? Well, I'm part of the US National Climate Assessment, and every 4 or 5 years, it summarizes all of the information on how we know that climate is changing. All around the globe, from year to year, as you can see on the left-hand side, we can have lower temperatures and higher temperatures, but decade by decade by decade, they tick steadily upwards. It isn't just about what thermometers are telling us, though, or what scientific instruments are telling us. We also know that around the world, if we look at when the peach trees are flowering in our backyards in West Texas, where deer ticks carrying Lyme disease has spread into the upper Midwest and even across the border in Canada, where Arctic sea ice is melting and glaciers are retreating, if we add up all the lines of evidence for a warmer world and a changing climate, we come up with 26,500 independent lines of evidence, some of which we can literally see in our own backyards here in Texas, telling us that yes, the planet is getting warmer. For more information on this at the local scale, there's 2 really great resources. First of all, NOAA has a program they call Climate at a Glance, and Bernadette's going to drop the link to that into the chat right now, where you can zoom in on any major city and any major region across the country to see what's been happening to temperature and precipitation and rainfall in your part of the world. Climate at a Glance is a great resource, and Climate Matters, which is a fantastic program that you'll hear more about from Bernadette, is a fantastic program that actually creates graphics showing what's happening. So if you sign up, and I live in Lubbock, you get the Lubbock and the Texas emails, and they tell you about things that are happening, how the allergy season is changing where we live, how our plants are producing more pollen as CO2 levels go up in the atmosphere, how we're starting to have to keep an eye on drought across the Southwest again. This is just from today or yesterday's email. This is a great way to keep in touch with what's already happening. It arrives in your inbox every week. But now we get to kind of the tricky question, the one where a lot of people sort of falter. Most people will say, sure, it's getting warmer. I would probably agree with you there, but how do we know it's humans? Are we really sure? Because hasn't it been warmer before? Well, yes, it has been warmer before. And you know how we know? Because climate scientists study it. We are the ones who study past change. And we are the ones who have told everybody that, yes, it's been warmer and cooler before. So when we see climate changing today, we don't just automatically jump on some bandwagon and start screaming, it's got to be humans. No, what we do first is we check out every natural suspect first to see if it could possibly be them. And only when we have crossed every single one of these off our list do we at that time say, could it be something else? So let me briefly take you through the top natural suspects. Let's start with the sun. Could the sun be causing our current warming? Well, it turns out that the sun's energy has actually been going down the last 40 or 50 years, not up. So according to the sun, we should be getting cooler, not warmer. And in fact, if you look at data, and there's a great resource called Skeptical Science that answers all of these frequently asked questions. Bernadette's going to drop a link to that in the chat right now too. So if you're looking for sources for these types of things, it's a great resource. As you can see, our global average temperature, the red line, has been going up. And the last 40, 50 years, the blue line has been going slightly down. Well, could it maybe be a natural cycle then, people say? And this is the most popular objection, particularly in Texas. A lot of people who are farmers or producers might say, I know all about natural cycles like El Nino and La Nina. One year it's wet, the other year it's dry. One year it's hot, the other year it's cold. How do natural cycles work? They work by moving heat around the Earth system, by robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. Natural cycles don't create heat out of nothing. They just move heat from one part of the world to the other, or from the ocean to the atmosphere and back again. So what does a real natural cycle look like? We had a big one back in medieval times. It was called the medieval warm period. And putting together natural thermometer data from tree rings and ice cores and sediment records, we can see that during the medieval warm period, it was warmer than average over the North Atlantic region. Those are the warm colors over the North Atlantic. Well, because this was a natural cycle, that heat had to come from somewhere, right? Go over to Siberia. If you were in Siberia at that time, was it the medieval warm period? No, it was the medieval cold period. All natural cycles do is move heat around the climate system. So what does it look like today? Are we just getting warmer over Texas or the US while another part of the world is cooling? No, the whole planet is warming. The ocean, the atmosphere, the land surface, everything. That's how we know it's not a natural cycle. Well, some other people say, okay, but we know that we had an ice age a while ago. So aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? And of course, we know, any of us who have children or grandchildren know that the last ice age ended when a rodent was looking for an acorn. And no, that's not the real reason. The real reason is because the Earth's orbit becomes more circular and then more elliptical over time. And the Earth's axis of rotation precesses like a wooden top. You know, when you spin a top, it goes around quickly, but then it also goes around slowly like this. The Earth's axis of rotation does that, changing how sunlight falls on the Earth. And that's why we have ice ages and warm periods like we're in today. So are we just getting warmer after the last ice age? No. Warming after the last ice age peaked about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And we started to get cooler, cooler. And then all of a sudden, boom, our temperature started to go up. Why did it start to go up? Our last natural suspect, volcanoes, it's got an alibi too. People often say, oh, I heard one volcanic eruption produces more pollution than all people do every year or 10 years or 30 years. That's not true. Volcanic eruptions actually produce particles that cool the Earth off like an umbrella. They go all the way up to the upper atmosphere, and then the sun's energy comes down. It gets reflected back off to space rather than coming down and heating the Earth. So big volcanic eruptions actually cool the Earth down for anywhere from a couple of weeks to as much as a year or two. No, the only explanation for what's happening is this. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun's energy shines down and goes through this blanket almost like a window. The Earth absorbs the heat, the sun's energy, and gives off heat energy. And just like a blanket would trap your body heat on a cold night, in the same way, this natural blanket of heat-trapping gases traps the Earth's heat, keeping us over 60 degrees Fahrenheit than we would be otherwise. In fact, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice if we did not have this amazing natural blanket keeping us warm. So what's the problem if this is natural? The problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we have been producing more of these heat-trapping gases. And they are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that we did not need. And that's why the planet is running a fever. Every other natural cause has an alibi. It really is us. Now, skeptical science, like I mentioned before, has great answers to almost 200 frequently asked questions. So if you're interested in more on these objections that we hear so frequently, check out Skeptical Science. But I want to move on now to question 5. Are we sure about this? Because you know those scientists are always changing their minds, saying that coffee's good for you and coffee's bad for you and coconut oil is good and coconut oil is bad. How sure are we? Turns out we're pretty sure. Why? Because the science is this old. We've known about the natural blanket since the 1820s. We've known that humans were adding to that blanket, and that would make the blanket thicker and make the Earth warmer since the 1850s. We've known exactly how much warmer it would get since the 1890s. And we've actually been able to measure the fact that the temperature of the Earth is increasing since the 1930s. At this point, scientists are 99.9999% sure, and it does not get any surer than that. So last question here, and then Bernadette and I will be taking your questions. Last question. How is it affecting the United States today? Why does this matter to us? Well, it turns out that not only is our average temperature increasing, but our variability is also changing too. And our variability means it's changing our weather patterns. Remember, I told you I'd come full circle back? Our brains aren't built to remember climate, but our brains definitely remember the weird weather. And a couple of years ago, I was standing in line at church waiting to pick up my son from Sunday school. And the man behind me was just making conversation. He said, "Do you feel like the weather's getting weirder?" And I said, "Yes, I've looked at the data, and I think you can say that, yes, the weather is getting weirder." And he said, "I knew it. I've lived here for 30 years, and I can tell that things are different." And so that's why I personally feel the best description of what's happening that we can see is global weirding. Things are just getting weirder. No matter where we live, we have always had floods and droughts and wildfires and hurricanes. It's just part of life on this planet. And if we live in Texas, we get more of them than anywhere else just because we get all of it, right? We get snowstorms and ice storms and hail, tornadoes, supercell thunderstorms, haboobs, droughts, floods, hurricanes, everything. Wherever we live, it's like we have a pair of dice and we always have a chance of rolling a double six. A heat wave, a wildfire, a storm. If we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice, naturally. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and then another and turning them into 6s and another and turning it into a 7. So then we start saying, how can we have 3 500-year flood events in Houston in 3 years? How can we have crazy record-breaking temperatures? It's because climate change is loading the dice against us, changing the statistics of our weather. What's happening? Specifically, we see that our heat waves are getting much more extreme and more frequent. We still get cold, but not as much. We see that wildfires are burning greater area. Our hurricanes are getting bigger and stronger, not more frequent, but bigger and stronger with a lot more rain. Our rainfall in general is becoming more intense and more frequent, and our droughts in many areas are getting stronger and longer. What do these headlines look like? The headlines should not ask, did climate change cause this event? Because we've always had these events before. The headline is climate change making it worse? And many times the answer is yes. We see that climate change is making our extreme heat worse, whether it's Siberia or the Great Lakes. We see that climate change is making our wildfires worse by drying out the vegetation and the soil. From the National Climate Assessment, this figure shows that without a changing climate, we would have seen about 11 million acres burned by wildfires since the 1980s. With climate change, we've seen over 20 million acres burned. That's how climate change is loading the dice against us. We see that heavy precipitation is getting more frequent because when a storm comes along now, there's more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump on us. And we're seeing that this is affecting us in the places where we live, whether it's the Midwest, Houston, China, Bangladesh. It's not just regular storms, it's hurricanes. Fed by warm ocean water, they're intensifying faster, getting bigger and stronger. They're slowing down to dump more rain on us. We see that hurricanes are affecting us. What do the headlines look like? Climate change likely supersized Hurricane Harvey. Climate change increased the economic damages of Hurricane Harvey by likely something to the tune of $67 billion. That's a huge headline. Climate change disproportionately affects women and children in low-income countries, Indigenous communities, Black communities, Latino communities, low-income communities, right here in the United States. The bottom line is that climate change is a threat multiplier. It affects every single one of us by taking the risks we already face today and loading the dice against us. And that is why there is always a climate story to tell, because it is affecting us here and now in ways that matter to every single one of us, no matter who we are. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Catherine, there are a couple of questions that came in ahead of time and a few coming in now. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, so I'm trying to prioritize everybody. One of the ones that came up that I think is so timely we should address is, I've seen you do this. Could you dissect the Texas event? Some of it obviously being related to weather and climate, some of it outside of that. But could you sort of put that in perspective for us?
Sure, I would love to. And I'm going to put some resources in the chat there too. So first of all, with the Texas event, why was it a tragedy? Because the grid was not prepared. Why was the grid not prepared? Because they made a deliberate choice not to do so. Wind turbines function in Antarctica. There's no reason for them to freeze if you buy the heating equipment. Natural gas power lines or natural gas supply lines don't freeze in Sweden. They don't freeze if you winterize them. 10 years ago, Texas had an extreme cold and ice event. I remember it vividly. I was stuck in Dallas that day. We had an event like that, and there was all these reports published saying, oh, we really need to do something about it, and pretty much nobody did anything. So the biggest reason it turned into a disaster is because we were not prepared. And that begs the question, if we are not prepared for things that have already happened, that we've already been warned about and we've ignored the warnings on, how much worse is it going to be when we see unprecedented events like Hurricane Harvey dropping 50 inches of rain, a large proportion of which likely wouldn't have happened without a change in climate? How much worse is it going to be when we see things that are much greater or bigger or stronger than we've ever experienced? That's really the bottom line there. Now, at the very cutting edge of science is the interesting idea that massive warming in the Arctic, it's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world, is affecting the jet stream, causing it to slow down, to wobble, and to allow excursions of cold Arctic air to reach much further south than they otherwise would. This is still at the cutting edge of science. There's scientists on both sides who are hotly debating whether this is actually happening, but there is the possibility of this, which means that even as the planet warms, we are still going to see cold outbreaks get all the way to Texas, which means all the more reason to take our preparation much more seriously than we have in the past.
And a great stat on that for those who are unfamiliar with it is take a look at your record highs to your record lows in your area. It was big news. It was cold, record cold. But think about how many record highs have happened over that time. It's greatly outnumbered. It's not news anymore because it happens all the time. The record cold news because it doesn't happen very much. So it's a good way to kind of put that in perspective. Yes. Another one is kind of tying a few different questions together here. And I see a comment that has popped up in addition to an earlier one about this 9-year limit. And I know this has to do with the IPCC's report. If you could reflect on that, and I think it ties into another question that's about the climate emergency, putting that in perspective. So just expand on that a little.
Absolutely. So I have put a Twitter thread in the chat. I would recommend everybody click on that because I have unpacked the fact that the 12, 11, 10, 9 years is not a scientific target. And scientists did not say we have this number of years left before everything goes to hell in a handbasket. Let me give you an analogy. Is there a magic number of cigarettes you can smoke? If you smoke 9,999, you'll be totally fine. There'll be no lung damage. Everything's a-okay. But you smoke number 10,000 and you are going to die of lung cancer tomorrow. Of course, we know that's not real. That's not the way it works. What we do know is every additional pack of cigarettes you smoke increases your risk. When's the best time to stop smoking? Not 9 years from now, as soon as possible. The sooner we stop, the better off we're going to be. And that's exactly the same with carbon emissions. So in October 2018, the IPCC's 1.5 degree report was released that showed the difference between a world that gets warmer by 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, or a world that warms by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So in that report, you know what they concluded? They concluded every choice matters. Every year matters. Every ton matters. That was the conclusion of the report. But in the report, in a figure, they showed different pathways to cutting our carbon emissions. All that matters is total carbon. But the thing is, we can't just go full speed ahead and then stop dead. We have to sort of tail off somehow, right? So this is the total carbon we can produce. How do we distribute that over the next couple of decades? One way we can do it is by reducing our carbon emissions about 45% by 2030, and then 60% by 2040, and then 100% by 2060. So there's different pathways to how we could cut our carbon. The more we use up front, the less we can use later on. Well, one of the pathways, cutting our emissions about 45 to 50% by 2030, somehow that turned into we have 12 years left or else it's all over. Literally, that's where it came from. And the reality is, the more carbon we burn now, the less we have to burn later. And the more carbon we burn, the worse off we'll be. The faster we cut our emissions, the better off we'll be. But psychologically, to induce urgency, unfortunately, many people decided we have to set a deadline for people. Nobody's going to do anything unless we set a deadline. So we're going to set a deadline, like having a wedding you have to lose weight for to fit into the dress. We're going to set a deadline so everybody gets on the stick and does it. Well, unfortunately, us humans, if something's 9 years away, we're like, that's 2 political terms. We've got tons of time. And so here we are fiddling while Rome burns and everybody's screaming about 9, 8, 7 years. The reality is the time to act is now. As you can see, I feel very strongly about this.
and as you said, every little fraction within every 1/10 of a degree matters. I mean, there's already people who are passing away, unfortunately, from these extremes. So we're already past some tipping points for some people. And 1.4 versus 1.5 versus 1.6. It's just, we need to act now is really the message. Another question that I think is really relevant to this, well, to everyone, but in particular in Texas, the immigration issue right now. And there is a tie to climate change. If you could expand on that a little bit for everybody.
Yes. So I very briefly touched in just one slide at the end of my presentation, how the impacts of climate change are profoundly unfair. They fall disproportionately on lower income countries that have contributed least to the problem. They fall disproportionately on already marginalized communities right here in the US in terms of traditionally Black or Latino communities. They disproportionately affect women and children more than men. They affect people who are disabled or in poor health, who depend on having electricity for basic services and functions. Climate change is profoundly unfair. And what that means is that it's increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Since the 1960s, climate change has already increased the economic gap between some of the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%. When disaster hits, stronger cyclones, typhoons, or hurricanes, longer, more intense droughts, heavier downpours and floods, when these things hit, people who are already living off $1 or $2 a day, who are already in precarious circumstances, who don't have insurance or the National Guard or a bank account to help them out, where are they going to go? Where will they live? How will they feed their families? For many people, the only option is to look for somewhere else to live. And so that is how climate change feeds the refugee crisis, with people, most of whom would rather stay where they were, but they cannot do so because they no longer have a way to literally feed their family or put a roof over their heads.
And we still have so many great questions popping up. So we'll be jumping in on some of the chat here, but I do have to hand it over to Mark. And as I do so, I want to leave everyone with this. There's a nice summary of climate change that both Catherine and I, our dear friend Ed Maybeck, has put out there into the world. It's 10 words, right? It's real. It's us. Experts agree. It's serious. And there's hope. And we can get in a little more to the hope even in the chat section here, because the seriousness of climate change, it's really serious. But remember, solutions do exist that are already in place. So with that, this is where we're going to get into a lot of the storytelling, and we're going to hand it over to Mark now. Go ahead, Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Bernadette. And Catherine, thank you again for joining us. I know how very cramped your schedule is these days. We really appreciate you making the time to be with us. So we're now going to shift from the more climate science oriented to the climate storytelling oriented part of this webinar. And we have 3 journalists. I already introduced them, so I'm just going to go straight through and ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll be taking your questions. So first, David Schechter, again from WFAA. I mentioned earlier, David, that you wrote this short piece, and we'll put it up in the chat, that ran in Columbia Journalism Review about how you overcame your feelings of intimidation, I think, about climate science in order to get onto the climate story. We're going to show real briefly the piece that resulted from you overcoming your intimidation factor. And this is the one that won the awards, folks. So it shows that you can go from being afraid to do this story to winning prizes for it. So Simone, if you could run that clip, and then we'll come back with David.
Alaska, a land of snow and ice and the fastest warming state in the country. That's Justin from Dallas. He's 38, a roofing contractor, and a staunch conservative. He rejects the mainstream science of climate change.
I've thought all along that it's a natural occurrence. I just don't believe that it's something that we're causing or creating.
I brought Justin to Alaska to answer 3 questions. Is the climate changing? Are people to blame? And how urgent is this?
We're on a glacier, man.
My name is David Schechter. I'm a veteran reporter, and now I work for you. I'm taking real people out on the road to get their questions answered, and you're coming along for the ride. This is Verify Road Trip. A trip across Texas was the first half of our journey. We learned that it's widely accepted by climatologists that in a matter of decades, we've spiked our atmosphere with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and that is causing the temperature on Earth to rise. At the midway point of this trip, Justin says the jury is still out.
My main takeaways from this first part of the trip were everybody's against me. No, I'm joking. They weren't really against me, but they had different opinions than me.
This is a route that people have been taking for thousands of years.
We're meeting up with Brian Bretschneider. He's a climatologist with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And Brian wants us to see a glacier. That means we're going on a hike.
I didn't sign up for this, man.
And it's straight uphill. And it's raining.
Oh, that mountain kicked my butt. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah. It's impressive. From a distance, it's kind of like a postcard. It's like what you always thought a glacier would look like.
By every metric, by every measure, our temperatures are significantly warmer here than they have been decades ago.
David, I want to make sure that I'm not muted here. I'm not. Okay. I really love how you say in that piece that I'm working for you. I think all of us as journalists need to remember we get paid by our bosses, but we work for the public. Right. And the public wants to hear this story. So take us through, how did you develop, what did you specifically do to develop the climate confidence needed to tell that story?
Well, I think the first thing I probably tried to do was Google climate change, and you realize that this is way more complicated than just I can get up to speed on this in a little bit of time. I guess when I knew that I wanted to do that story, I realized what a blind spot I had, that I clearly informed, reading things, watching things on TV, and accepting that the climate is changing and that humans are to blame, but not having my own confidence to go out there and do a report like this. And so when I said, let's do this, I realized, gosh, the problem is I don't know enough. And then I realized that I had been intimidated to not know enough, that not only was it this a big global issue and was it affecting us locally, but also there was so much hot air going on around it. You even had your president saying at the time that it was a hoax. We had our governor, our previous governor, saying that there was no consensus on it. And so you just end up in this both sides stance where you feel like, if I don't present this as a controversy, then I'm exposed to all kinds of criticism. And so I knew I had to get over that. And I also, then it kind of just boiled down to, what are the documents that I can cite? I'm not going to go do the research, right? I mean, that's not my job, but what is the bedrock science here? And then you get kind of, cheapish to admit that it's not that complicated to figure out that there is incredible research on this. I would say we've researched a lot of topics and our stories are really research heavy. I've never seen any topic in science more researched than climate change has been. And then you say, okay, well, what are the foundational documents? And you go to the IPCC, which Dr. Hayo mentioned, which is this gold international standard of thousands of scientists working together, which is essentially unchallenged in its science. And then I didn't know at the time, I'd heard of the IPCC, but I didn't know about the National Climate Assessment that the United States government and 12 government agencies and hundreds of American scientists, including Dr. Hayo, have a companion essentially document that shows the climate is changing in the United States. And here's why, and here's where it's worse, and here's what could happen in the future if we don't address it. Here's what will happen even if we do address it. And it's all there. And so it's this process of saying, these are unchallenged pieces of incredible documentation that allow me as a reporter to go forward. And if anybody wants to challenge me in my reporting, they're actually challenging these documents, which essentially have not been successfully challenged ever.
You're reminding me of a quote that the Penn State University climate scientist Michael Mann delivered when he was featured on a 60 Minutes broadcast at our Covering Climate Now partners at CBS News in October. And he said, there is as much consensus among scientists about climate change as there is about gravity. So those of you on the call, when you're challenged, go back and check that 60 Minutes clip. It's on our website. It's from October 4th, about as much consensus as there is around gravity. So David, I've already mentioned that your piece, which is such a beautiful example of TV journalism in general, aside from its climate message, that won an award. But aside from how your fellow journalists regard that piece, what was the reaction of your audience and your management and so forth? Because again, I think a lot of people think that there's a lot more controversy to this than there really is.
Well, I think in terms of internally, so if I'm coming at this from a lack of climate confidence, you have to accept, and I think it's not to say anything negative, but your organizations, the organizations that we work for, also lack the climate confidence. So I was like I wanted to go down this rabbit hole. And so I was leading the charge for our organization, which hadn't done this kind of reporting before. And so all the challenges that Dr. Hayo spoke to, you have to be able to address those internally. And I almost wrote out something pretty similar to that sentence, to those 11 words internally, to kind of take this around, say, hey, I want to be able for us to report that the climate is changing, that people are the cause, that it's urgent that we work on this as a society. And, that was real helpful, because you could go to people and they could say, well, show me how, what's the evidence there? And then you could present, here's the IPCC, here's the national assessment. And to get your editors along, to get them comfortable, because they feel like they're taking a risk, just as you feel like you're taking a risk. I think the audience's reaction was, it's hard to tell what the audience's reaction, did people go out and change? Because you don't know, they didn't tell you. But what we really tried to do is provide sort of like open source reporting. Here's Justin. Justin saw everything that I saw. We didn't miss anything. We were together every step of the way. Justin is still out there in the world, and he can come back and say, David's a fraud because he cut out part of my story. We encapsulated his story. And I think that process, that open source kind of reporting, is what lent a lot, which lends a lot of credibility to what we have done and the way we tell stories.
Thanks, David. That's David Schechter of WFAA in Dallas. And we're going to switch now to Lisa Olsen. Lisa, you have been saying something that we at Covering Climate Now have been saying for a long time, and your work really illustrates it very well, that climate change is a story for every beat in the newsroom. And you have covered lots of different stories on a lot of different topics, as we mentioned, but in particular, you've reported on how climate change impacts hurricanes, flooding, sea level rise. And one thing that I learned from you is that the situation in Texas is not that different from the situation in Louisiana in terms of the threat from sea level rise. So can you take us through how you brought the climate angle to light in your coverage of all of those various topics?
Well, I want to talk about kind of in the way we were just hearing, about how it is intimidating even for an investigative reporter who's worked with data to tackle climate change. But my real point of entry was last summer, I did a series of stories about the impact specifically on Superfund sites of climate change all over the United States, but focusing more on Texas. And like others have said, and Catherine went over, there's certain things that are very well established. So as reporters, we don't really have to take a risk by saying, okay, if we're going to look at the impact on Texans of increasingly intense hurricanes or more frequent flooding or wildfires or sea level rise, the science is very well established that climate change is playing a role in those things. And I think we all know to some extent that those are affecting us, particularly in Houston, where we have had those 500 years floods in just a few years. But in terms of that Superfund story, what I was trying to do was look at exactly what she said. We have some assumptions about how we may be safe from contained, super dangerous, toxic waste sites because of measures taken in the past in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s to contain those sites. But I was examining the proposition that a lot of them are now being flooded regularly by climate change, or they're being subsumed by the rising seas. They're literally sinking into the water. And I visited a lot of those sites across Texas and learned from biologists and others that those sites are literally on top of flood-prone communities. They're on top of fishing communities. They're on top of tourist towns. They're on top of big metropolises like Houston. And that series talks about how toxic waste is more likely to be released, obviously, when flooding increases and when storms increase. And that the dangers to all of us are real, not only from climate change itself, but also from the toxics that we have stored historically in floodplains, being more subject to those same forces. So that was a series that I did last summer that actually anyone on this call could do. You could look at the Superfund sites in your own community. The GAO has identified those sites that are vulnerable to those different types of climate change. And you could delve into what's the threat. The EPA ranks those sites as to which are most dangerous and worst. And that was, like I said, an instruction for me into how to delve into climate change specifically, but more generally in the past, certainly reporting on hurricanes, it's been very obvious over the years that we're getting hit in Texas with larger hurricanes, with more costly hurricanes, that sea level rise means that some of the communities that were flooded in hurricanes can really not be rebuilt safely. And I wanted to encourage everyone to look at, there's great data, as others have said, from NOAA about the impact of these more increased storms and other extreme weather events for every community in the country. You can look at your own county, your own city. How many extreme storms have you had? What are the damages estimated, reported to NOAA? What are the numbers of deaths? What are the numbers of injuries? And you can put recent storms in context with 10 years of data fairly quickly using that NOAA data. I've done some of that. And I think also we've got to all challenge the assumptions that have been made in the past. All these storms also mean economic damage. They mean insurance companies having to pay out more. They mean lawsuits. A lot of the reporters who've been working on the big freeze event have discovered, that some of the government assumptions, like Catherine said first about how weatherized the system was, they weren't done properly. The estimates of the climate change effect on the system was not done properly. But the bottom line is more people paid, and there's been some really good reporting on how, the damage estimates are not adequate, that probably twice as many people died as the government is telling us. So we've got to, as reporters, I think, delve into not just climate change, but the impact on our communities of climate change, the losses in property, the losses in lives, that are happening in the coastal United States, as well as in places like Central America, where then people flee from hurricanes and end up trying to move to Texas and other states. So those economic influences, those influences on human lives are stories that are coming up more and more often all across Texas. So no matter where you live in Texas, whether you're in a flood zone, whether you're in a hurricane zone, whether you're in a wildfire area, whether you're getting hit with these regular dust storms that are associated with some of the droughts, those are all climate change related. And I think we shouldn't be shy about using the government data, about making sure we develop meteorologists as sources, not just for stories about weather like we've always done, but about climate. So that's a long answer.
I was trying to be polite to mute myself. And so that was a good answer though. And it really hits on something that, again, we've learned through our research at Covering Climate Now, that you mentioned of the Superfund sites, that everybody can do that in your own community. What audiences especially want in their climate reporting is reporting that speaks to their community, the conditions in their community. So if you're wondering how to get started, find a story in your own backyard. And in that regard, my second question to you, Lisa, is you also taught me something about this recent, the cold snap there in Texas, that it's fairly well known that Texas has a lot of wind power. What I did not know until you told me the other day is that a lot of that generating capacity is not connected to the big cities, Dallas, Houston, et cetera, in Texas, because they didn't bother to build the transmission lines, just like they didn't bother to weatherize the wind turbines. So what specifically, for your colleagues there in Texas, what specifically could they do? What kinds of stories can they do now to advance the story around what happened in February as we try to avoid these mistakes in the future?
I think one of the troubling things about the cold snap is that we're not getting great information from our government about the real causes, other than the lack of weatherization of plants. That's the only thing that's really come out so far. But I think, we haven't talked much yet about the causes of global warming in this webinar, and certainly the use of fossil fuels is one of the major ones. And certainly part of the reasons why so many of us were literally in the dark and in the cold for so long is that our grid is still very dependent on fossil fuels, particularly in our major metro areas. Houston's is very dependent on a nuclear plant, as well as a number of other natural gas plants and a variety of things. The nuclear plant went out. We did not have enough energy to supply ourselves. Dallas is very dependent on a series of coal burning plants, which are some of the biggest offenders in terms of air pollution and global warming. And ironically, even though, like you said, we're leaders in wind generation, the fact of the matter is that we've been building these huge natural gas pipelines to supply our power plants with the natural gas from West Texas and from the oil patch. But we have not built the transmission lines to make sure our cities could take advantage of the wind energy. And I think there's different reasons that can't tell you about why those wind farms haven't been developed closer to the major metro areas. But most of them are in West Texas, far from us, and the transmission lines just aren't there. So, when you're talking about the cold snap, in each section of our state, there's a slightly different story that we should all be keeping on top of about why we're not taking advantage of the alternative energy forms and why we are still so dependent on those more traditional historic forms that failed us in the storm.
So there you go, folks. There's a number of very specific story ideas for you to follow up. You can start even this afternoon if you're really feeling chipper. That's Lisa Olsen with the Texas Observer. She's sticking around with us, as is David Schechter. And now I'm switching to Diana Hunt. She's with Indian Country Today after a long career at the Houston Chronicle and elsewhere. And Diana, I want to talk to you about science, because as we were prepping for this call, you, like David, said that a lot of reporters and editors are shy of the science part, of science in general, not just on climate change. And we've been writing for a long time at Covering Climate Now that the single greatest mistake that the American media as a whole, not just in Texas, has made on the climate story going back 30 years now, is that they've treated it as a politics story rather than a science story. And that's why you saw all this crediting for many years of both sidesism, and if Republicans and Democrats disagree, it's obviously a controversy, but it's not a controversy if you look at the science. So first, take us through why is it that not just reporters, but editors tend to be not as literate on science as they should be? And more importantly, how do we get past that now? You're still muted, so let's unmute you and start your answer again. Let's see there.
Unmute. There we go. Good.
There we go.
All right. You can hear me now. Sorry
Yep.
about that.
All right.
I think I grew up in Texas. I went to public schools in Texas. Science has always been a weak spot, I have to say, in the educational system in general. But what the problem is that editors, reporters, they don't want to get it wrong. They want to understand it. They don't feel that authority to draw conclusions that I think they do in other kinds of stories. And that's something that can be overcome. I know most of you all are out there sitting there saying, well, I'm not Lisa Olsen and I don't have all these years of experience and knowledge. And I'm not David. And I didn't say, you know, my place is not going to pay for me to go to Alaska to learn this story. And so you have to work your way through it. The reporters don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to misrepresent something. And the editors think, well, if I assign this person to cover something complicated, it's going to take 2 months to come back with a story, and we're not going to be able to cover the basics that we need to do. So those are really issues for newsrooms and reporters and editors in general. And the solution, I think, is that you just have to do it. You have to go into it and ask a lot of questions. I was named to be an assistant business editor right as the economy was collapsing in 2007. I didn't know what a credit derivative was. I learned, I asked questions. I read 3 different versions of the same story to figure out, well, maybe the Washington Post is going to explain this in a little different way than the New York Times. And so you just have to ask questions. And so for a local community, you look at what's happening around you and you want to know why did this happen? What contributed to this? And then you have to understand what the answer is. And if you don't understand it, nobody else is going to understand it either. If I'm not at all shy about saying, I'm sorry, could you explain that again? Because I don't think I understand this. Or do you mean this? And they go, oh, no, I don't mean that. I mean this. And so by that back and forth process, which is hard to do by email, it's a lot easier to do in person, you get the answers that you can begin to understand. And then the next time you do a story, you can build on that knowledge and expand it on a little bit, you know, a notch here and a notch there. And pretty soon you're going to understand many of the stories that you're doing. Then you'll move on to something else. The science stories that we do, many of them in Texas have climate connections. So if you have a drought and we did a story at the Houston Chronicle that I signed on the decline in production of the famous Pecos cantaloupes. And I happen to really like Pecos cantaloupes. And I thought it was a good story. And the reporter went out to West Texas and did a story on it. But the impact on, there's the story for you. The impact, there were underlying issues. I mean, the connection to the oil and gas industry, which is a big issue in Texas. The lack of the fact that the immigration for farm workers had declined. I mean, there were a lot of different issues, but those issues underlying that story could be tied back to climate. And I think that's true with a lot of stories. Flooding in your area. Do you have record flooding? Why? What's causing that? Find some experts in your area who can help make those connections. And you're not going to feel comfortable doing it initially. Find somebody who will. And eventually you'll start to feel comfortable that this is an acknowledgement. This is something that's accepted and it's something that you can do.
So part of what I hear from you there, Diana, is that there has to be support from the top of the newsroom. The editors, and indeed you've been a publisher, the publisher has to say, look, we are going to allow the reporters to educate themselves, give them the time to do that. You've talked also about how communities, readers really care about these kinds of stories. And that maybe is the solution to that first part of the problem, is to get the publisher and the editor to understand that readers actually want this kind of coverage. It's not like you have to make them eat their broccoli. So can you speak a little more about that?
I think that it's an issue of connecting with the people, and if I care, if something is affecting me, it's going to be affecting my neighbors, it's going to be affecting other people. So I always try to look for the human impact, the human face of what's going on. We had record rains. Well, that means a cluster of people in one community were flooded, or we have drought and people are leaving to find other jobs. And so I would disagree slightly that you have to have a support from the top. And I would deny saying this, but you don't always have to tell your editor and your publisher what you're working on. If you say, I've got a good story, and then you go out and they say, what's with that story? You say, I still don't fully understand what's going on. I want to make a couple more phone calls. And then when you understand it, go back to your editor and say, okay, I've got this. This is the story I have. I think it's a good one. Now, can I have some time to take that extra step? But you have to understand it yourself before you can sell it to the folks above you. So do a little work quietly. Sometimes don't even tell them what you're working on before you get that understanding, but you'll find some really good stories, and that will lead to other stories.
I love it. I have to say, as a longtime reporter who's also been an editor, I love that advice. Stand up to your editor. Don't be afraid. And your editor will be grateful for it when you bring in the stories that really matter and that zing with your audience. Thank you. That's Diana Hunt with Indian Country Today. And we are now going to shift to the Q&A session with all of your questions. And one of the first ones that I want to begin with, because I think it kind of ties together a lot of things here, is how do we cover all the various aspects of climate change, from urban heat islands to sea level rise, et cetera, without having to rehash the climate science basics every time in the story? How do we do that? And I'm not even quite sure which one of our panelists wants to answer that first, but if you raise a finger, I will call on you. David, please.
I just was thinking last week, President Biden announced his American Jobs Plan. He had, during the campaign, promised 500,000 charging stations across the country. And he put, his plan includes a lot of money for electric vehicle development, for charging stations, all that. So that's a great story to localize, right? And I think there'd probably be a inclination to just say, well, let's do a story about the growth of electric vehicles, and the president wants to grow electric vehicles or whatever, and not even talk about the climate change piece, because that makes us feel a little weird, and we don't know. But with the confidence of saying, I don't need to prove climate change every time I'm doing a story, you can go out and localize that story, go to the Tesla dealership, go to the electric car supporters group, whatever, go to charging stations and say, what if we had, 80, an extra 100,000 charging stations in Texas? What would that mean? Or right in our community, and just say that this is a solution for climate change, that this, that electric vehicles are reducing carbon emissions is a known way to reduce the glide path on climate change, and just leave it at that as part of your story. I really think that having climate change as part of your story, of all the stories that we do, of the heat wave, of the cold snap, of the dust storm, of the pollen, like all these things we've talked about, if we can just mention that in there with confidence, and be able to rebut anybody saying, you guys are always talking about climate change, and have some confidence to move forward, that's the way to do it. I think assigning us, like the story I did, is a great example, but a terrible example, because I don't think that people should have to, my fellow reporters shouldn't feel like that's the standard for reporting on climate change. Do it when the president announces an initiative on electric vehicles.
I think one thing we can do too is share, like we have, like many newsrooms do, resourceless sources so that people all across the newsroom know that if they need a quick, reliable expert to talk to on climate change in Texas, here's 2 or 3 people. And it, like Diana said, this isn't just a story for the environment reporter, it's a story for the ag reporters, it's a story for the energy reporters, it's a story for the business reporters. And so those of us who've gotten a little bit of orientation, I put together a list of sources and links for this. I'm sure it could be expanded, and each of you will find your own local experts, but hopefully, you can take that, distribute it, add it to other links that have been suggested by the panelists, and be that person who empowers other people in your newsroom. Sometimes all it is putting a sentence of context. Global warming has increased temperatures all across Texas, and extreme weather events have been costly, period. I put in a link to the state climatologist report on the impact on Texas. You may decide you want to just use a quote from 1 or 2 people as a go-to, or a collab, a sentence that you all agree in the newsroom is one you feel comfortable using as context. I think just making sure the context is there is important. We use context in a lot of our stories. That's part of our mission as reporters, right? To help people understand. Thanks.
So basically, don't overwrite the climate science part of the story. Just state it as fact. Remember, it's about as controversial as gravity. We don't say we have to report on why gravity works when we talk about planes falling out of the sky. There's also a lot of resources in terms of sources and background that you can provide in your pieces. Covering Climate Now, of course, has them on our website. Climate Central and Climate Matters in the Newsroom have a lot of them. Sciline is another great source for scientists who will answer your questions on deadline. Bernadette, can you refresh it's Sciline, right?
And SCI line. I'll put the link in the chat.
Sciline. So we have a few more minutes here. Let's talk quickly about let's get down to some nitty gritty, how to localize stories on climate in Texas. Diana, what would you, if you were still at the Chronicle, Houston Chronicle right now, what would be the localized climate stories that you'd be trying to assign? You're still muted.
Sorry about that. I would call the beat reporters together, and I would say, you need to look for underlying causes in the stories that you're doing. The housing issues, people are moving into different areas, agriculture, immigration, they all have an underlying link to that. And when you do these stories, you need to put those into context. And so in Texas, we have a serious drought that's about to start, that's getting underway now, particularly, I guess, in West Texas, although it stretches into a lot of areas. Things are changing in ways that can't be explained any other way, obviously. And when those things impact, I'm in Tennessee at the moment, and the ticks are exploding here. I mean, there are ticks everywhere, yuck. And it's pretty awful. But that's gonna be in Texas too. I mean, that's one of those things people are talking about locally in their neighborhood that can be a news story that can carry a bigger impact. When you say it's heating up, that's producing more insects, that's making it more difficult to avoid coming into contact with these little suckers. So those are the kinds of things. Every story you can look for an underlying, because I don't think you have to tie climate to every single story you do, but I think you need to be intelligent about the way you analyze your story and look for the bigger picture. And that's where having that expert you feel comfortable with, the professor at the local university, the professor probably in maybe somewhere else, so that you don't have to put somebody who's going to take pressure from the local community. Lubbock has some great professors who do a lot of things. and tap into those folks and say, is there an underlying issue here that I'm missing? What do I need to know about this issue? Just ask questions, just get curious about it. And they may say, no, that's probably just this. But you can ask those questions of any story. I also want to touch on something that Lisa said, which is that once you start to become comfortable with these issues a little bit, you're going to be the resource in the newsroom. People are going to come to you and say, I don't understand this. What are parts per billion? I don't know what this means. And you're going to start to become the resource, and you can say, check with this person, check with that person. And you may not do every story, but you might help guide some other reporters in that area. And that's really helpful.
So finding things like ticks in Tennessee and Pico's cantaloupes, those very specific things that the audience is already talking about in their own lives, that's an excellent entry point to localizing your climate reporting. Bernadette, could you also talk a little bit, because of course, Climate Matters in the Newsroom is always localizing and giving it hints to reporters about how to do that. And by the way, everybody on this call, if you're not already signed up for those resources from Climate Matters in the Newsroom, do yourself a favor and get on that list. Bernadette.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of ways you can jump into this. I'm almost going to flip the question for a minute, because unfortunately, climate change is affecting almost everything right now. So there's a few ways you can get into it. The first and the easiest is, I even saw a question about how they want to do longer form stories, but they're on a daily turn. Make that connection in the stories you're already doing. That's the first thing I suggest to everyone out there. If you're doing a story about heat and it's changing your football season and they're practicing at night, guess what? It's not just because high pressure is over you. It's because we have more greenhouse gases that are making heat more intense. That's the link. Make the link in a line and move on. If you're covering any sort of weather, I see that Sue has also posted the quick facts. Make the link and move on. If you're talking about bugs, make the link. Move on. Gardening season, allergies, all of this is connected. Then once you start to get more confident and you understand these connections, you're going to see more stories. It's not going to be so hard to find them. They're going to come right to you, because unfortunately, everything is being affected, from our water systems, our food systems, our politics, which we've hit on, our energy systems, migration, immigration, our ways of life, the things, going to a baseball game, it's getting hotter and it's actually even affecting the game. So all of this is being affected by climate change. So start small, make the connections where appropriate, ask questions. Guess what? You dive into really complicated issues on other topics. Don't be afraid. Science is on your side. And as you learn, these stories are going to become obvious to you.
David, could you speak a little bit to perhaps, again, this question of, we're in such a rapid turnover news environment, ecosystem now, that how do you, especially reporters on television where, especially if we finally get past this pandemic, we can actually go back out into the field with cameras. How do you make sure that you're not just hitting those daily stories, but you can bring something deeper? And is there anything that you want to tell us about that you're working on right now along those lines?
Well, in terms of doing a deeper story, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, I think the one thing that has come up for us, and we've been hampered a little bit by the thing you just said in terms of health and safety, but we had at least 3 state officials say that renewable energy was not reliable energy, and so we want to ask the question, is renewable energy reliable? And so that's not even necessarily directly a climate story, but you certainly have to have like the starting point of why do we have renewable energy? What is it doing for us on the climate front? And then you can have these interesting digressions of like, well, what is our expectation for reliability for our energy? What does that mean it needs to be there 100% of the time every day? What have we even planned for? Like I think if politicians say, well, if we can't get the wind out every day, then that thing sucks. and that wasn't really what it was even designed for. So there's a great opportunity to continue to explain these big things that happen to people. We did a story, and maybe contrary to what Lisa said about West Texas, but Texas does lead the country in wind generation because they invested like $5 to $7 billion in the transmission lines to West Texas. There still are bottlenecks in places, but that kind of policy and thinking about energy and thinking about addressing these solutions, starting to think about problems on one hand, and thinking about solutions, which generally can be pretty grand things, can be pretty big things. So, overheating in the football game during double days, or getting rid of double days, and the connection between climate change and football practices, we can do that here. And then we can say, well, we need energy for the future. Where's that going to come from? What kind of solutions are out there? What kind of solutions don't even exist today? How much are we relying on technology that doesn't even exist to go to the places we need to go? So there's so many great, interesting questions when you're really curious about it and have that foundation of you can't push me over now on climate change, because I'm not going to get pushed. I'm not, once you know the facts, it makes it much easier to move to that next step. Add a sentence, do a story, do a bigger story, do a bigger story.
I hope you do a follow-up, David, on why isn't Dallas and Houston, aren't we getting more of that wind energy? It's particularly Dallas. I mean, you guys are pretty windy up there.
Why we don't have the turbines themselves
why
here.
You don't get more of the wind energy as a share? Why isn't the supply being built up, especially in North Texas? Would be a fun thing to ask about. Why are you still, on the coal? Like West Virginia, only a worse, more polluting kind of coal than West Virginia.
Right.
Yeah, I think that basically, like, those kind of questions, things we're curious about and our audience is curious about, is what I think drives those longer term investigations for those people who are, always doing dailies but want to do long-term investigations. I would say, one of the really good things to do is just start working on an idea little by little. Maybe an hour you have one day, or a Saturday when you're working a cop shift and nothing's happening. You start filing records requests. And sometimes the ideas, say on a climate change thing, will come out of a daily story that you do. You think, oh, I wrote the story about the drought that's predicted for this year, or the fire that is just happened. But maybe the project you want to do builds on that, and you want to look back at all the fires in the last 10 years. How many people were displaced in your county if you live in Bastrop? How much insurance claims were paid? I can guarantee you that those stories in the moment, we think we covered them in the moment, but really the damages and the cost of these kinds of climate challenges, disasters, are usually much greater than what we learn about in the moment. So going back at those, even if it's just an anniversary story, can be almost like a mini investigation and a kind of a climate change type of story, or a trend story.
Can I jump in there for a second? I just wanted to add, I think it's always good to be doing stories that are in the zeitgeist, that people are talking about, because it's easier to get them greenlit and approved. And so when you're talking about, I think we still are, all of our newsrooms probably have a really good, hopefully good emphasis, better emphasis now than we used to, on social justice issues and minority community issues. And there's a connection there too between climate change. And if you start looking under that rock, that might be a story that's easier to get greenlit, because it connects to something that we know we've all stated we are going to do a better job on. So that's one way to look at it as well.
Yeah, and I think I was going to mention with the coal.
I have to cut you off because we have to get to Bernadette to wrap, but I want to thank our three journalist panelists very much: David Schechter at WFAA, Lisa Olsen at the Texas Observer, Diana Hunt at Indian Country Today, for all those tips. One more tip from yours truly. I've covered the climate story for many years now, and a great place to get ideas for which rocks to turn over: talk to the NGOs, talk to the environmental groups. We're not activists, we don't carry their water, but a lot of times they're out there on the front lines and they see problems that are developing, and they can lead you to great stories. So now I'm going to turn it over again to Bernadette, who will take us home.
It's always so hard. Sorry, Lisa. I mean, we could go on with this conversation forever. So what I'm going to do here is share one more time a wrap up of some of the things that we've been talking about, in addition to some new resources here to get everyone thinking about this and get people ready to report on this. Here's that summary. The 10 words of climate change, if you have to come back to it: it's real. It's us. Experts agree. It's serious, but there is hope. So resources. A lot of these have been covered by so many people today, but I just want to bring them together for you. And we're going to have an email following up with a lot of extra resources too. But the National Climate Assessment, which Catherine was the lead author on, Southern Great Plains chapter has everything you probably want to know about Texas and how climate change is affecting you. The IPCC, a new version of that's coming out this summer. And there are regional climate hubs for all of these offices: Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, EPA, NOAA regional climate centers, your local universities, and you have so many good ones in Texas. Definitely tap into the knowledge there. They're on the cutting edge of what's going on. The Yale Climate Opinion Map, Skeptical Science, Sciline, and Climate Nexus does a roundup of climate news if you want some other inspiration. Covering Climate Now has put out some great resources, and some of the most recent are highlighted here. Reporting Guide, Living Through the Climate Emergency. This is a good primer to get you ready for the upcoming week of focused reporting, which we're going to hit on in just a moment here. We already touched on this. Our media library, Climate Matters. This is where you can go to sign up for the information and get these packages that we send out every week. We also have some additional resources, a weather power tool. Again, weather power is powering our society already with sun and wind, and Texas is the leading state with wind power. This is a great story to dive into and learn more about. With the coastal side of everything, we have a sea level tool. There is so much information and extra data sets, over 100 data sets, really dissecting what's at risk as these waters come up, from the populations to the built community and environment around it, what hospitals, what schools, all of that. We've got this great new resource that we put out called Climate Reporting Masterclass. It is at climatereportingmasterclass.com. If you want to dig into some of these subjects a little bit deeper, multimedia modules, do it at your own pace. And this is really exciting news. Covering Climate Now, focused week of reporting, joint coverage week, living through the climate emergency. There's so many stories that fall under that banner coming up April 12th to 22nd. Some other upcoming opportunities to sort of get you programmed of how to report. We have a webinar. It's Uncovering Climate Solutions, and it's going to be with the Drawdown folks and Dr. Jonathan Foley. So that'll be coming up Friday, April 30th. Also, Earth Day. This is the time it's so easy to get a story approved, right? Because we all care about the world on this day. April 22nd, Show Your Stripes, Global Warming Stripes. It's a campaign we've been doing in June. The IPCC, the big body of scientific evidence. It's every 7 to 8 years that they update their science here. It's happening this summer. The date's still a little fudgy here because of COVID. And then Climate Week September, COP26, the big international climate change conference, is coming up in November. So a lot of really big things. And I do have to wrap. We are out of time. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming today. In particular, I want to thank all of our panelists. Just some great conversations. We had a blast preparing for this and having all of our prep conversations. I hope you've enjoyed it, participating with us today. And as always, want to thank my dear friend here, Mark, because it's just a pleasure hosting these with you. So hope everyone got something out of this. We really encourage you to reach out to Covering Climate Now. Sign up for the material. Join in this process. We are here to help you. Climate Matters in the Newsroom. We have the weekly material. We have the training resources. So all of our organizations are going to support you in this effort. If you have questions, reach out. And also WFAA, thank you for being a great host in this. I hope everyone has a great day, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.